and we've got a very exciting lineup of panelists who will be exchanging thoughts on this topic. I will be hosting the panel. My name is Arzish Baki, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at Smart Karma. Before I jump into a short introduction on each of our panelists, I'd like to remind the audience that you can send through your questions via the Zoom platform, and I will try my best to get to them at the end of the session. So we're glad to have the following panelists participating today. We have Lai Chung-Wen, who is the CEO and co-founder of Ninja Van, Southeast Asia's leading technology-enabled logistics company. We have Dr. Badri Gopalakrishnan, the founder, director of Infinite Sum Modeling LLC, an economic strategy consulting firm. Dr. Badri is also an economist with the University of Washington, Seattle, and McKinsey & Co. We also have Frank Benzimra, the current head of Asia Equity Strategy and multi-asset strategist at Societe Generale. And we've also got Mr. Jörg Arel, the group CFO of Thai Union, one of Thailand's largest producers of seafood-based food products. And finally, last but not least, we have Ashish Jina, the co-founder and COO of Jumbotail, an online wholesale marketplace for food and grocery in India. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this panel, one that promises to be an exciting one with some pretty diverse viewpoints. So, without further delay, let's jump straight into the questions, shall we? First question for the panel, and I'm going to ask Chung-Wen, Jörg, and Ashish to take a crack at this. Your respective businesses operate in geographies where there have been lockdowns and circuit breakers put in place. Could you share one positive and one negative of what that has meant for business?
Sure, well, perhaps I can go first. Yeah. Well, the circuit breakers definitely enforced more social distancing. So what we have seen is e-commerce volumes have gone up, but obviously the mix of what's being delivered has changed. I think what's interesting is we're hearing a lot of feedback that people are more willing to pay for delivery. I think the whole mindset of buying something online, getting a larger assortment online, building up your faith and confidence in online sellers, it has been ongoing for the last 10 years, for example, in Southeast Asia, but I think it's really accelerated that trust and dependency on a wider assortment online. And obviously being a supporter of the entire e-commerce ecosystem, we're definitely seeing a lot of growth and it's been quite useful for us. The downside, I suppose, would be that if people buy more, but manpower is constrained, social distancing in our sort centers, operationally, we are definitely hampered. So on one hand, more business may be a good thing, but if you are not so able to handle it, hiring is constrained, operationally, it's a lot more of a hassle. You do disappoint more people and people get displeased. So it's really trying to figure a way to absorb the volume while doing everything we can, because it's definitely harder. I mean, that's what I've been seeing.
I think two really good points, Chung-Wen, and that would have been one of my negative lessons in this, and that is around logistics, customs documentation, certificates that are required to export products, and often government agencies and other agencies are just simply not fast enough to switch from the typical hard copy original signature type of approach with three versions to a digital workflow. So we saw a lot of our shipments stuck in customs. Not long, it's not like it's impossible, but it's just hampering. And I think this is where people could learn more and say, look, how can we embrace really end-to-end processes? Also where blockchain can help enormously if governments would start to collaborate cross-border and allow such things to happen electronically. But on the positive side, there are also some good things. And one of it is when we move, for example, our accounting teams and treasury teams and processing teams to work from home, everyone was like, wow, how does that work? We work on paper, and how can we document this. And people really stepped up and set up workflows among departments to make things quicker, change the sequence of when does which document need to arrive somewhere to really de-bottleneck operational processes. We had some very, very good learnings around that.
So I think from my perspective, just to give you some background, we serve about 25,000 mom and pop retailers who account for nearly 95% of all food and grocery demand all over India. So we're focused mostly in South India. In terms of what we've seen, I'll start with the negatives. I think definitely echoing issues around manpower availability. There have been lockdowns. Conditions keep changing on a day-to-day basis. But I think that and I think wherever the marketplace that we operate has depended on sellers who themselves either were stocking very little inventory, we've seen massive stockouts there. And so we operate a hybrid model where we also allow sellers to stock in our facilities, and those have actually been much better in terms of availability to customers. We've seen massive spikes and changes in mix. So that does create, as Changwen was saying, a difference between what expectations you set and what you can actually achieve. But I think on the positive side, huge movement towards digital and supply chain resilience across customers. We've got a lot more people signing up. These are mom and pop stores that actually were dependent on largely traditional offline supply chains, either distributors getting CPG or FMCG products, or having to go to large aggregated markets, wholesale markets, which both of those are not possible at this point in time. So we've seen a huge spike in demand from that perspective. Government has actually been, at least in some of the cities that we've been operating, quite, cognizant of the potential of e-commerce and supply chains like ours. And I think that we've seen a lot of support come up, and a realization that this is a good way to serve people. And I think also a validation of some of the decisions that we've taken around, we don't have a sales force, so 100% of our orders come through, people coming. We're a B2B platform, but we don't have a sales force. 100% of orders come through the app. We have an in-house supply chain which we chose to build. That's proven a lot more resilient than third-party players, which haven't always been able to adapt. I think also just opportunities that a lot of younger brands have seen, and we've been able to see where availability actually trumps brand at times like this, especially during lockdown situations where retailers and consumers themselves have actually been much more open to trying out new brands, and this creates new opportunities going forward.
Thank you, gentlemen. One of the kind of themes we picked up on through the day today is that this situation with COVID has been a bit of a catalyst for the embracing of the digitization, etc. I think it's something that kind of a lot of businesses are migrating towards more out of necessity now as opposed to choice, and I think that's something that you kind of touched on as well. Another question I'd like to ask, and this is for specifically for Badri and Frank. While it's still early days, do you see the talk and trend of protectionism and nationalism redrawing global supply chains? And who might the beneficiaries be of this?
Maybe I can start the conversation, if it's okay. So I think there are four broad things that I see happening at the moment. First thing is, trade is already shrinking because of various other things that we just discussed, right? Even the domestic consumption is falling, and that has a greater hit on trade, imports and exports, because of the obvious challenges in transportation and logistics and so on. That's happening kind of organically at the moment, and it could probably be kind of short term, but it can also persist for a while. The second thing that happens is what you mentioned, which is like a direct tendency to increase protectionism. So the countries are already talking about and not only talking but actually implementing some actions like increasing tariffs, incentivizing firms to relocate from different countries, like what Japan did for Japanese firms in China coming back to Japan, and things like that. And Like you said, that nationalism and protectionism has already begun to some extent. And the third aspect I see is not only policy driven, but also even the industries themselves, on their own will, like the market forces, they're also showing signs of relying more on domestic supply chains than on global supply chains, and that is mainly because of the risks and the uncertainties that they faced recently, or they are facing currently, and they don't want that to recur in the future. So when I've talked to some industries in India, for example, and even in the US, I see that they're already beginning to calibrate things like that. They're even okay with a few percentage, increase in prices, increase in costs. They're willing to take that buffer, but they don't want to rely too much on global supply chains. And the last thing, which also was just discussed a little bit, was this digitization and change in technologies, which is again going to affect trade. There was a study by ING a couple of years ago, which said that 3D printing can reduce global trade by 30%. And I also done some studies which kind of corroborate that. Robotics, automation, 3D printing, and so on can render trade kind of redundant, because the comparative advantage and other things don't make sense anymore. So I'll take a pause there. So these 3-4 factors, maybe 3 factors other than just protectionism, can lead to a situation where protectionist policies would have led to anyway.
Okay, and maybe if I can add a few elements on what Badri has said, and especially when it comes to the shrinking trade, and just to give you a few numbers, and to see also on your question on the who could benefit. I was reading recently some study from a consultant, and looking at 14 low-cost countries in Asia. And what we can see is that the import of manufacturing goods from the US has shrunk from a little bit more than 800 billion in 2018 to 760 or something like this in 2019. So that means that we had 60 billion less of import. And then you look at the detail, and what you see is that the decrease of import has been from has been aimed at China, so minus 90 billion from China. So which means that there has been a number of countries in Asia, in Mexico, which have benefited. So we have this trend in protectionism, in trend in nationalism, which already in 2019 has started to happen. And then the other thing, and the second thing that we can note, and if we focus on the trade between US and the rest of the world, is that what we can call the manufacturing ratio, import ratio, which is which is looking at the total import divided by the output, has, for the first time last year, since the beginning of the decade, has started to decrease. And it means actually that it's not that there has been some reshoring or repatriation to the US, but more that we have seen some redirection of trade. It has been quite clear in the case of Taiwan, for instance, last year. We are already seeing in the case of Mexico. So this is definitely a strong trend. Although we can see a number of hurdles in that trend.
Thank you, gentlemen. Very enlightening, and Frank, especially nice numbers in there. Always good to hear that. Next question, Changwon, this is specifically for you. Ninja Van recently raised new money in this environment, $279 million to be precise. Could you shine some light on what types of demand for your services you're seeing and how these may vary between the countries that you operate in? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, perhaps to clarify, we closed the round in the midst of COVID-19, but the round has been ongoing, and we didn't just start the round because of COVID. So I wish that were the case, and COVID was so good for our business that everyone piled in 2 months, but I think that's not the case. So just to clarify that. More importantly, in terms of how the business is going. So for example, in the Philippines, they had a very strict, enhanced community quarantine, and that affected our entire operations because we couldn't operate. Essentially, courier was deemed non-essential and our vehicles were not allowed to move on the roads. So obviously there was an almost complete shutdown of the network. It took a lot of effort to do nothing essentially. So that was painful. Shutting down an entire network like that is a huge planning exercise in itself. Now that the quarantine has shifted to a more moderate approach, we are allowed to operate. But getting the entire network up to speed again, getting almost 10,000 drivers on the road back on the roads to just clear out all the parcels on the network, that takes a lot of effort. So it is quite a major effort for us now to ramp up the Philippines business. But for the rest, it's quite similar to what I mentioned previously. You will see, and we have seen e-commerce growing. It's also interesting to see that more than the platform growth, the marketplaces, that has always been kind of the mainstay on e-commerce growth because they always had enough resources to invest into changing the mindset and behaviors of people. COVID-19 has changed that mindset for everyone. And what we are seeing is a lot of offline retailers, a lot of small retailers starting to shift to the online sphere, finding very innovative ways of connecting with their consumers. So this entire shift is quite interesting because it is not just a monopolization of the e-commerce market by the platforms, but you're seeing a lot of small businesses come up, engage their customers in many different methods. And unfortunately, e-commerce logistics is quite standard. We don't do anything that different. What we do is we help them get their shops up quickly and help them ship from their home or their small office or their retail outlet. So it's been quite an interesting shift in what we're seeing in e-commerce as well.
Thank you, Changwon. That's an interesting perspective. Jorg, I've got a question for you. Thai Union is now one of the largest seafood producers in Asia. Could you talk to us about how you've ensured you're keeping up with demand for products like canned tuna, for example? Could you also talk a little about the development of cold chain logistics in Asia? Thank you.
Yeah, let me start with our tuna and ambient seafood supply chain. Look, I mean, this situation creates peak demand. There are a lot of households and consumers who are stocking up, and it's not just pantry loading. A lot of it leads to real increased consumption. People are at home, they need to cook at home, and tuna is a very healthy ingredient for many, many dishes. We're investing a lot in helping people on social media to adopt new recipes. And it's not just about the new tuna sandwich that people want to have. There are a lot more varieties on dishes. But it's very correct. It does create supply chain disruption. You have peak demands. You have out of stock in some markets. And it starts to raise certain questions around the rules of supply chain that we are all grown up with. And those rules were about scale effects, about reduction of inventories, about how can I build bigger, better, more cost-effective plants? How can I reduce SKUs and all of that? And this is how we all grew up with. Now, with COVID, but even before that, with the explosion of small, with a lot of craft suppliers and recipe creators, and with a lot of local domestic brands growing and exploding everywhere, The question is, are these rules really correct? We take opportunities because we have large inventories in some areas. We take opportunities because we have a secondary or third plant that can produce the same thing. We take advantage because some of our plants are exactly geared towards small batch production. Something entirely counterintuitive to the way how we used to operate. Look, I'm the CFO of a large business, so I look at a large warehouse. I don't like it, right? Large warehouse will be filled with a lot of inventory, and you don't like it. And then you go through a COVID crisis, and you realize, oh, well, okay, that was good that we did this risk buy in December. And then you go back and realize, well, there are actually quite a lot of supply chain disruptions if you look over the last 10 years. And those supply chain disruptions are becoming more and more frequent. And you have customers and clients who say, hey, can you give me a small batch? Can you give me this production? Can you do it closer to my market? So we need to come up with new ideas to look at the overall cost of ownership and to take out the last cent of conversion cost per unit may no longer be the ultimate optimization criteria. I think we may need to look at real total cost of ownership. And sometimes it's better to spend these couple of cents more for the second or third risk supplier that you have. But then you have him, and if something happens, then you can react and you can switch your supply chain. And we have one of the cases just right now. We have some COVID cases in one of our plants in Ghana. We closed the plant a couple of weeks ago. We shipped the majority of the capacity to a secondary plant in Portugal and to another plant here in Thailand. And we can mitigate majority of these effects. And you suddenly realize how the network is stronger than having those mega plants that bring you these amazing benefits if everything goes right. But we know more and more often things do not go right. So your second question, I guess, was around cold chain logistics in Asia. And look, we expect, and if you Google this, you see this everywhere, there's a 12, 13, 14% growth per annum expected over the next 5 years, at least. This is a major industry. Markets like Japan and India are, of course, leading. China is a very, very important market, especially to reach second, third, fourth tier cities. And look, the key focus is on reducing wastage in perishable foods. And the growth in the processed food sector is absolutely pushing this even further. And with COVID, and a lot of the colleagues here on the panel said the same thing, you have a lot of consumers who move to B2C purchases. And we see the same in frozen seafood. And we see this in other frozen food sectors. So we believe there is going to be a massive growth in the frozen supply chain. Key topic, of course, is end-to-end traceability, and to have a real reliable end-to-end supply chain that does not have a weak link, also not on the last mile, which is often where the problems are. But we believe there's going to be a lot of investment in this area.
Thank you, Jörg, for that illuminating response. Appreciate it. One last question that I'm going to ask the panel before we open up for Q&A, and I'm cognizant of the time constraints, but we might kind of spill over for a few minutes. Given that Insight 2020 is, after all, a digital investor conference, the question I'm going to ask now in more specificity is about how investors are reacting to the current challenges facing supply chains. So I'll open this up to the floor, but if not, I'd like Frank and maybe Badri as well to take a stab at this. equity valuations. What is the impact of building resilient supply chains for earnings? What is an appropriate risk premium to embed? And how do investors judge or determine whether a firm's supply chain is indeed resilient? Are there any telltale signs on the financial statements in terms of specific ratios, etc.? That's the question, and feel free to ask me to repeat it if you need me to. Frank, I believe you might be on mute.
Well, that's a lot of questions, and I wish I would be able to answer them if I had the answer. But yes, let me take the investment point of view, and what happened. You can look this at two levels, and from a global asset allocation, if you are a multi-asset manager, or you can look at it from an equity point of view, that you are covering some single stock. And from a global assets, what we can see, if I want to be maybe oversimplify, is the supply chain, the international trade is here for a reason. It's a division of labor because it is cost efficient, and so. One of the concerns that we see is that you could see at some stage rising cost. Now it's all about of a demand shock, so you don't see any inflation, of course, but that is something that for if you're managing a portfolio on the medium term, you need to take into account. And here, the traditional assets that you would like to hold, the commodities, oils, are maybe not the one that you would like to have in this environment, and maybe you are going to look at inflation hedge, or you could look at inflation linkers. So that's really from the global asset point of view, and then coming to the equity part, and what is making an equity is well, basically you have a flow, a stream of earnings, an interest rate, and a risk premium. And here, what we see is that it's important to distinguish between short term and long term. And on the short term, the real concern is not that much on the supply bottleneck. And here, I am not talking of from a market point of view, from an operational point of view, but really from a market point of view. The short term, there is a demand problem. And this is really what is causing the concern. But on the long term, yes, you can see some supply side problem, and then you need to embed this in your risk premium. So which means that the very high valuations that you had on a number of equity market, because the risk premium has shrunk, is something that you have to question it. How much? That remains an open question, but certainly the valuation on the long term should decrease. And the other thing that we see from the equity point of view is there are going to be more dispersion in valuation between sector, certainly between services and industry, but even within industry, you are going to see some increased dispersion. One of the panelists was talking of, I think it was Badri, talking of the importance of robotization of technology in the supply chain. And you have a number of names in Japan, for instance, in automation. And I think those names in machinery and especially in factory automation, well, we need to look at them quite carefully from a valuation point of view, and other which are more involved in the transportation of goods, in the shipping, while they might be durably impacted because we need to have another kind of risk premium on those names.
So I think Frank has answered most of it, but I just want to add a couple of things which are kind of answering these questions that you asked now, and also some of the previous questions, which is there are going to be some geographies and some sectors that are probably going to be more more positively affected than negative, and that is something the investors may keep in mind. In terms of sectors, we have seen things like tourism, travel, food, accommodation, food, not as in food products, but restaurants kind of sectors. They are going to be more negatively affected. So those equities are going to be negative, and then some of the other sectors can be positive. And in terms of geographies, the countries that that have been less affected in terms of both the shutdown and the supply chain disruptions and demand side in the short term, countries like Vietnam or Taiwan, some of these countries which have been pretty good at managing the crisis. I think they companies there probably can rise faster than others, recover faster. And second, and finally, with all this digitization, robotics, automation that we are talking about, there is going to be greater demand in terms of trade in primary goods. So the equities on those kind of commodities like minerals or raw food, those kind of products can be on the rise. So I think that's what I wanted to kind of add to both this and previous questions.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Badri, for that. Really appreciate it. Time indeed flies when you're having fun. So we've crossed the 30-minute mark. With your collective permission, I'd like to spend the next maybe 3 to 4 minutes taking a few questions from the audience. I've got a few questions that have come my way, and here we go. Quick question for Ashish. We've seen Facebook enter the space by investing into Reliance Jio through JioMart. Are you seeing a sudden and big pickup in attention from global majors as a result? Also, could you offer your perspectives on JioMart?
That's the multi-billion or trillion-dollar question that everybody seems to be talking about. I think our perspective on this is, the mom and pop store in India has always been, the largest channel by which food and grocery is actually transacted, right? It's a $600 billion industry, 95+% still flows through mom and pop. And, throughout the lockdowns and COVID, mom and pops have actually stood the test and actually come out of it probably better than anybody else. I mean, big box has been, in pretty bad shape due to restrictions. E-commerce has unfortunately not yet been able to scale up. There's some challenges associated with manpower. There's also issues around, I think the long-term unit economics of, B2C e-commerce because of, maximum retail price restrictions in India. So there's this broader fundamental questions there. I think there's no doubt that, there will be a massive transformation of mom and pop retail in India. I think Reliance will catalyze part of it, but it's part of a broader trend, and I think that's only been accelerated probably 4 or 5 years by COVID. Home delivery will become very critical. I think a lot of traditional supply chains, like traditional mom and pop distributors, wholesale markets, will actually suffer significant issues because of restrictions currently, but also anything that requires face-to-face interaction or large numbers of people coming to one place, or dependence on credit, which we haven't really talked about, but that's another big challenge that we've seen in this current climate. Anything that and a lot of traditional models actually require that. So I think it's actually good news for the sector. It's actually very topical because I think over the next 4 to 5 years there will be a massive transformation. Mom and pop stores will become much more modernized. They will become branded. There's multiple players actually working on that. And I think the entry of Facebook and Reliance actually only puts a much more broader spotlight on that space. And I think anybody working on that space, more consumers will come online. Brands will recognize that their supply chains need to plug into this. Retailers will also move. So I think it's positive. It's a good thing for the economy. And it's good for whoever's actually working on modernizing retail, modernizing food and grocery supply chains.
Well, sounds like a very good tailwind for your business. So I wish you the best of luck in that context. Quick question for Changwon. This is from the audience as well. Ninja Van, to a large extent, has changed my perspective on the role of B2C customer success by a B2B company like NinjaVan. Your WhatsApp integrations, SMS messages, etc., have helped you build a customer brand that makes its money from B2B. Are there any plans on leveraging on the customer-facing brand strength that you've been able to garner?
Well, that's a fantastic question, to be honest.
Yes.
Whoever asked that question, I applaud you for using our services and appreciating all our consumer touch points. It's something we've been very focused on, making sure that we bring a lot of seamless connectivity and convenience to the end consumer. And what people don't see as consumers is that we do even more for our real customers, which are the businesses. So I think there are a number of examples of express logistics players who try to venture into the consumer space as well, because they touch the consumer so often, because they're so consumer friendly essentially. And truth be told, the name NinjaVan was designed to be consumer friendly. If not, we could just be ABC Logistics, right? That makes no sense. But the reality of it is, the future we see in our business is always an enablement layer. We never want to be consumer facing. We never want paying consumers, because we believe our mission, our vision is to connect businesses. It is not to monetize consumers. And I think the moment we lose track of that and we go down a consumer path, I think it put us at loggerheads with many of our clients. And I don't think that's the way we should be playing the entire value chain. Knowing where we play, which is we sit beneath e-commerce companies, we support them in their growth, we help them connect with consumers better, we make the logistical experience better. In fact, one of the major focus points we have now is that we want to enable all of these small offline to online retailers with a very strong supply chain. So we want to democratize the entire retail network, where we allow any retailer with a good eye for curation, with a fantastic consumer engagement strategy, to not worry about economies of scale on the upstream parts of the supply chain. Let us help you with all your supply chain. Let us help you with your domestic distribution. Focus on getting the best products and engaging your consumers. I think that's where we want to play in, and very squarely do not want to deviate from that. Because if you think about it, with more than 30,000 folks on the ground, full-timers, with all these touch points, I think it's very easy for us to get extremely distracted and do everything under the sun. And that's probably a good way of getting nothing done.
Well said. Well said. I'm going to ask the floor one more question, and then we'll let you gentlemen go. It is quite late. This question is specifically for Badri, Frank, and York. In 2008, we saw a big liquidation in inventory, and GDP growth was eventually catalyzed when there was a big inventory restock from the Western economy. What are inventory levels across global supply chains at the moment? And when do you see a possible global restock?
Yeah, look, I think I can at least respond from the food supply chain. There has been a lot of destocking, especially in hospitality, F&B, from lockdown of restaurants, hotels, cruise ships, airlines, and so on. So there was a massive inventory depletion from there. Now that's everyone's guess how quick this will come back. My own estimate probably dovetails more with pessimistic views in terms of how this ramps up. I think this is not going to ramp up as quick as people think. In that sense, it's probably different to prior crisis situations. So I would be probably a little bit more careful on growth scenarios that suddenly kickstart and compensate for all of that. People have stopped buying cars in previous crisis times, and then there was a need to buy more cars again. I think people have grown up. There's a lot of digital transformation that people have embraced in their family lives and their home environment. So I would not be surprised if such a restocking process takes longer, if it ever gets back to where we had been.
I think I also share the same view, and in addition, the sharing economy has been going on for a while, and that is going to be reinforced now. And automotive sector, for example, has been stocking inventories even before the crisis started. So it has been going down across the world even before, partly because of the changing behavior of buying patterns of cars and so on. So I think that is also going to play a bit, and the inventories stocking up now are probably unprecedented in many industries, because this level of depth and duration of a crisis hasn't been something we have seen before in our lifetimes. So I think, like, I completely agree with Jargon that it's anybody's guess how long it's going to take, and it's definitely going to be longer than 2008 recovery. And so yeah, I think that's my point of view.
Yeah.
We'll just wait for Frank to.
Yeah. So sorry, I just had a little bit difficulty to unmute. Yeah. So I basically share this the fact that the restocking is going to take a little bit is going to take longer. Well, and we are in a massive uncertainty, and how we read today what's going on. We have one certainty, is that the world now is in recession. But two things that are more uncertain, and the way that we are reading the market and having our sector allocation is, number one, what's going to be the speed and the path of the recovery, and number two, what are going to be the permanent change that we are going to see after the crisis. And this is something that we are all actually wondering, what is it? Because there is no precedent, and it is the first time that we have a voluntary made recession, if I can say, and there will be certainly some permanent change in the way that we are consume goods, and it's going to accelerate some trends. So I think that not only for the economy as a whole, it's going to take some longer time to recover, but then we are going to see more spread, more difference between the different sectors in terms of valuation and in terms of allocation.
Right. Thank you. So a recovery might be a bit further down the road than people think. Okay, I really appreciate all your insight collectively. And gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the panel for today. Thank you to all the panelists for their invaluable input and viewpoints. Thank you to all the attendees for dialing in, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. So this brings us to the end of day one of Insight 2020. We look forward to having you join us for tomorrow's sessions, which will focus primarily on the capital markets and mergers and acquisitions. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.